So we have the salpingopharyngeus, the palatopharyngeus, and the stylo-pharyngeus. The palatopharyngeus originates from over here, from the sides of the palate, and descends on the constrictors. As you can see, it's on the superior constrictor, then the middle constrictor. This is the origin line of the middle constrictor, and eventually the inferior constrictors as well. Now the salpingopharyngeus descends from the auditory tube and fuses with the fibers of the palatopharyngeus. The stylo-pharyngeus is from the stylo-apparatus. It emerges in the gap between the superior constrictor, this is the superior constrictor, emerges in the gap between the lower border of the superior constrictor and the upper border of the middle constrictor. So it's emerging from this gap and then is descending on the surface of the inferior constrictor as well as then coursing on the aspect of the middle constrictor as well as the inner constrictors. Salpingopharyngeus, palatopharyngeus, and over here we have the stylo-pharyngeus. Salpingopharyngeus, palatopharyngeus, and over here we have the stylo-pharyngeus, and that is why they're the inner longitudinal, because they're inner to the circular muscles and they're coursing on the inner aspect of the constrictor muscles. Now let's talk about some other stuff about the gaps. But before that, when we talk about the pharyngeal wall and we go from the inside to the outside, first of all there is the mucosa, then there is the submucosa, right? And after that we don't immediately jump to the muscles, rather we have a fascia known as the pharyngeobasilar fascia. Let me just get another color, and we can see a part of it peeking out, because the fact that we are seeing the muscles means most of the fascia has been removed, but we can still see part of the fascia in this area. The name is the pharyngeobasilar fascia, or the pharyngeal aponeurosis, whatever you want to call it. Pharyngeobasilar fascia or the pharyngeal aponeurosis. Fibrous sheet which is internal to the pharyngeal muscles, internal towards the lumen of the tube, thickest in the upper part where it fills the gap between the upper border of the superior constrictor, this is the upper border of the superior constrictor, the concave upper border, and the base of the skull. So over here it is thickest and filling the gap between the base of the skull and the concave upper border of the superior constrictor. Superiorly, the fascia is attached to the basi-occiput. This is the basi-occiput. Technically, the suture should be somewhere over here, right? So it is attached to the basi-occiput, right? And to the petrous temporal bone, there is also an attachment. The attachment is also over here to the auditory tube. So basi-occiput, auditory tube, the posterior wall of the medial pterygoid plate, which is over here. So basi-occiput, auditory tube, posterior wall of the medial pterygoid plate, and also even pterygomandibular raphe over here. Okay? Basi-occiput, auditory tube, posterior wall of the medial pterygoid plate, even the pterygomandibular raphe. But lower down, the fascia is gradually lost deep to the muscles, and it hardly extends beyond the superior constrictor. Attachments: basi-occiput, auditory tube, medial part of the pterygoid plate, and the pterygomandibular raphe. So it hardly has any extension below this point. So after the pharyngeobasilar fascia, then we have the muscular coat. First of all, we have the longitudinal muscles, the salpingopharyngeus, the palatopharyngeus, and the stylo-pharyngeus, which emerges at this gap. After this, we have another fascia known as the Buccopharyngeal fascia. So this Buccopharyngeal fascia is outer to the longitudinal and even the circular muscles, and the Buccopharyngeal fascia extends beyond the pterygomandibular raphe to form the fascia over the buccinator muscle, which is the muscle of the cheek. And like the pharyngeobasilar fascia, the Buccopharyngeal fascia is similarly more well developed in the upper part of the pharynx. Now this is the outermost part of the pharynx, and then we have the deep fascia and the skin, etc., whatever. Not deep fascia, the superficial fascia. And between the muscular coat and the buccopharyngeal fascia, we have the pharyngeal plexus, specifically outer to the middle constrictor. Thing to understand is that most of the muscles, including the longitudinal and the circular, are supplied by the vagus nerve, except the stylo-pharyngeus, which is this muscle over here. This happens to be supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve 9, I believe. So that's an important point, that all of the muscles, with the exception of the stylo-pharyngeus, is supplied by the vagus, and the stylo-pharyngeus is supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is an interesting thing to keep in mind. Vagus for most of the muscles, stylo-pharyngeus is an exception, is supplied by the glossopharyngeal nerve. Now, the arrangement of the superior, the middle, and the inferior constrictors is such that the middle constrictor overlaps the superior constrictor, right? And the inferior constrictor overlaps the middle constrictor. Another thing is that there are gaps. The first gap is between the upper concave border of the superior constrictor and the base of the skull, and is filled by the fascia known as the pharyngeal basilar fascia. But there are structures that indeed do pierce it, 4 to be exact, and this is a very important question. First one I would think is very simple. It is the auditory tube. Then it's this muscle over here in purple, levator veli palatine, and this very important muscle also pierces the fascia. In addition to the auditory tube and the levator veli palatine muscle, there are 2 arteries I've shown like this, palatine, and so one of the arteries is the ascending palatine artery, and the other one is the palatine branch of the ascending pharyngeal artery. Auditory tube, levator veli palatine, ascending palatine artery, and the palatine branch of the ascending pharyngeal artery. Pharyngeal for pharynx, and we already have the levator veli palatine. So palatine artery, ascending palatine artery, and the palatine branch of the ascending pharyngeal. First gap, contents very important. The fact that the first gap is filled by the pharyngeal-basilar fascia is also of maximal importance. Now the second gap is between the middle constrictor, between the superior constrictor and the middle constrictor. And we've already talked about one such structure which basically passes through it, that is actually a longitudinal muscle, the stylo-pharyngeus. And the second important structure is very easy. It is a glossopharyngeal nerve, this one. And the interesting thing is that the stylo-pharyngeus is the only nerve not supplied by the vagus and is in fact supplied by the 9th cranial nerve. Now let's talk about the third gap, which is between the middle constrictor and the inferior constrictor. So this portion over here, and we have a nerve and an artery. The nerve is the internal laryngeal nerve, and the vessels are the superior laryngeal vessels. And the internal laryngeal nerve and the superior laryngeal vessels, they basically pierce the thyroid membrane, which is this membrane over here. So the gap between the middle and the inferior constrictor, internal laryngeal nerve, and the superior laryngeal vessels. And then let's talk about the gap between the lower border of the inferior constrictor, and obviously the esophagus starts. So the gap between the esophagus and the lower border of the inferior constrictor, we have an artery and a nerve. The nerve is interestingly this one over here, which is the recurrent laryngeal nerve, and the vessels are the inferior laryngeal vessels. Recurrent laryngeal nerve is a very important branch of the vagus, and the inferior laryngeal vessels are also important. So these are going to be traversing the gap between the inferior constrictor. So the name is very telling, inferior laryngeal nerve, and between the esophagus. This is very important. Now normally what we're saying is that there is an overlap between the constrictors, but the inferior constrictor is not overlapped. So in the posterior wall of the pharynx, the lower part of the thyropharyngeus, so specifically the thyropharyngeus, lower part of the thyropharyngeus, in the lower part of the thyropharyngeus, in the posterior wall of the pharynx, which you cannot see in this view, there's just a single sheet of muscle, so there isn't any internal overlap, and so this part can be considered as a weak part. And this weak part is directly beneath or between, we can say, the cricoid lamina. We can show the cricoid lamina like this. This is the cricoid lamina. So it is directly beneath, the upper border of the cricoid lamina, which is this part over here. And the upper border of the cricoid lamina also corresponds to the level of the vocal folds within the larynx. So below the cricoid lamina's upper border, and this area is limited by the cricopharyngeus, because eventually the cricopharyngeus will appear, which is a strong muscle. Right? So inferiorly limited by the thick cricopharyngeal sphincter. And so it's not a weak area because the cricopharyngeus is a thick muscle compared to the thyropharyngeus, which is thin and a single layer. Right? So sometimes, because of in this particular weak area, there's a formation of diverticula known as the pharyngeal diverticuli. So the reason for this is because this weak area in the posterior wall of the pharynx, corresponding to the thin sheet of the thyropharyngeus, thin unoverlapped sheet, is known as the Killian's dehiscence. So we are saying that sometimes diverticula develop over there. But what is the cause? It is because the nerve supply of the thyropharyngeus and the cricopharyngeus is different, and so is their function. Thyropharyngeus contracts to cause propulsion, whereas the cricopharyngeus is a sphincter. So when thyropharyngeus is contracting, this needs to be relaxing. But the fact is that the nerve supply is different, right? So this one is supplied by the pharyngeal plexus, right? So basically by the vagus through the pharyngeal plexus, and the vagus is actually conveying the branches of the cranial accessory nerve. But the cricopharyngeus is supplied also by the vagus technically, but by the recurrent laryngeal nerve. As you can see, the recurrent laryngeal nerve is passing through the gap between the esophagus and the lower constrictor, and as it is passing through the gap, on its way it is giving a branch to the cricopharyngeus. So the recurrent laryngeal nerve is supplying the cricopharyngeus. So if there is a damage to this place specifically and the constriction is maintained, then there will be retrograde movement of the food bolus, and that would cause backward movement of the posterior wall, leading to the formation of a diverticula known as the pharyngeal diverticula.